All right, good morning, good afternoon. We're so excited to have you today. We are going to be talking about motivation in our teens. And I, as a parent myself, definitely challenged with this as we are a couple months in. So excited to hear from Dr. Amy Mezulis and her team with Michelle and Monica today to walk you through some tips on how to keep our kids motivated at home. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Amy Mezulis. She is the professor of clinical psychology at SBU and founder of Uplift Navigator, which is a teletherapy practice for teens and young adults. And she's got about 20 years experience in adolescent mental health as a professor, researcher, practicing clinician. And I'm excited to have her lead us through with our guest experts today to help keep our teens motivated during the pandemic. So off to you, Amy.
Awesome, thanks, Anne. And hello to everybody in the audience. We're really happy to have you here with us. I believe we have predominantly parents. Hopefully some of you are watching with your teens or young adults, but also I know we have some educators and clinicians in the audience too. So happy to have all of you here with us. So as Anne said, my name is Amy Mezulis. I'm a clinical psychologist. My area of expertise is adolescent and young adult mental health. I've been on the faculty at Seattle Pacific University for almost 15 years now, where I teach in the PhD program and do research and supervise clinical work all with adolescents and young adults. I'm also a licensed psychologist, and I have a small practice myself in addition to managing Uplift's teletherapy practice, which is specialized in adolescent and young adult mental health. So we treat problems like depression, anxiety, self-injury, disordered eating, self-esteem, stress management, motivation, all from an evidence-based, skills-focused approach. But separate from all of that, I'm also the parent to two teenagers. So I have a 17-year-old high school senior and a 14-year-old high school freshman. And so I am right there with you all on the parenting front too, of trying to navigate these sort of unusual times in terms of helping them, keep up with their academic and personal goals, but in this remote social distance world where a lot of the normal incentives and support structures are no longer available. So we hosted a webinar a few weeks ago broadly on teen mental health through Uplift. And one of the biggest questions we got at that time was, hey, this is all well and good, but my kid literally is staying in their room, not doing their schoolwork. I can't sort of get them motivated to care about their homework assignments, their studying for tests, keeping up with the sort of Zoom training protocols for their sport. What can I do about my kids' motivation? And so we have convened this panel with two experts on adolescent and young adult motivation to help answer those questions, kind of explain, what is motivation? Where does it come from? Why are our teens showing such low motivation right now? This is a really common problem and concern. And most importantly, what can we do to help kids kind of get back on track with their goals? How can we support them as clinicians, parents, and educators? So I'm really delighted to have two guests. I'm going to let them each introduce themselves in turn, but Michelle Kuhn is a licensed clinical psychologist here in Seattle. She works with us on the Uplift team. She also works at Seattle Children's Hospital, and one of her areas of expertise is neurodevelopment. So she's going to give us a little bit of perspective on kind of adolescent and young adult brain development and how motivation develops and sort of what's normative to expect of a kid this age. And then we're also very fortunate to have Monica Kowalski, who is from the University of Notre Dame. She is a motivation researcher. She's also done a lot of work in public and private schools and as a college counselor. So she has all sorts of perspectives on the application of motivation, specifically in academic settings. And she's going to help us understand a little bit more about what exactly motivation is and how we can foster it in our kids. And so I won't say anything more, but if Michelle and Monica, you guys could just give a couple-minute introduction to yourselves, I think that would help everyone. Michelle, why don't we start with you?
Sounds good. Glad to be here. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Amy. I don't have too much to add. As Amy said, my name is Michelle Kuhn, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I work here at Children's and then also at Uplift Navigator. I see patients both places and do research at Children's. I work with children, adolescents, and their families, and I specialize, as Amy was saying, in disorders that stem from brain development differences. So that would include things like ADHD and also differences in attention, motivation, And then the downstream effects of that. So a lot of the times when kids have chronic differences in motivation and attention, that can be really frustrating and can cause anxiety, and kids can notice that about themselves and be really distressed by it. So we see things like anxiety be more common in those children, depression and mood problems be more problematic in kids who have more chronic problems in those areas. And so all of that is kind of in my wheelhouse of how I work with families, teens, and kids. So thanks for having me here. I'm excited to share what I can.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Amy, so much for inviting me to be part of this today. My name is Monica Kowalski. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame. I work in our Institute for Educational Initiatives, mostly teaching and supervising beginning teachers. I'm a former second grade teacher myself, and I also worked with high schoolers as an admissions counselor for the University of Notre Dame before I went to Ohio State to earn my PhD in educational psychology. As Amy said, my research interests are around motivation and specifically how teachers influence student motivation in schools. And I'm excited to share some of this knowledge with parents because I think it's really applicable there as well. So I'm also a parent myself. My oldest is about to turn 11, so I'm just entering the trenches of parenting adolescents. I also have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you both. So I'm going to moderate sort of the questions for our experts starting off. And then we have planned this webinar, so we have plenty of time at the end for questions from everyone in the audience. We want to make sure we really address the issues that are most important to everyone out there. But I'd like to ask Dr. Kowalski to please start with a little bit of sort of what is motivation? Like, how is it that we can understand what it even is, and how can that give us some insight into why motivation might be looking so low for our teenagers right now? Monica?
Great, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to provide some background there. So what is motivation? Well, motivation is really an internal state that activates and maintains and directs our behavior. So it's the will to do something or what drives us to act. So when I say it's an internal state, that means that it does come from within a person. So it is really personal, and it can vary a lot person to person, just like any other character trait may vary. So some people are just naturally more or less motivated. You may notice that in your own kids or in other people that you know, like you have your go-getters, and then you have those who tend to kind of sit back and relax, or maybe need an extra push to get things done at different times. So motivation can vary a lot by person, and it can also fluctuate within a person depending on their context. So you may be really motivated when it comes to sports or math, but then maybe not so much when it comes to reading or having to clean your room or other things like that. It's really normal for motivation to be different in different subjects or different activities, and for motivation to change even over time. So when we think about what's normal motivation for teens, there is actually a lot of variability in what normal might be. Now, there are some developmental changes that happen throughout life, and in adolescence in particular, that might impact motivation. And I think Michelle's actually going to talk a little bit more about that later in terms of brain development and how teens are wired for instant gratification or for rewards. But aside from that, I think there's also some kind of basic universal principles of motivation that can be helpful to understand in teens. So first of all, even though I said motivation is internal, there are ways that you can influence a person's motivation through features of the environment or ways that you interact with a person. So there are things that you can do as a parent to help your child be more motivated. And we're going to talk about those in a little bit later as well. So I think it's also helpful to understand kind of the basics of motivation, that motivation is usually higher when there's a genuine interest in something. So whether that is an intrinsic interest, like something that you like for its own sake, something that you're really just naturally interested in, or if it's an interest that's due to some appealing outcome or reward that's tied to the activity, there is higher motivation when there is some genuine interest in that activity for its own sake or for another reason. It's also higher when you have a good degree of confidence that you'll be able to be successful in something. So I think we can all probably think about times in our own lives and how much more motivating it is to do something when you know that you're capable of it, rather than something that kind of feels out of your reach. So that's why I might be really motivated this year to train for a 5K run, but I would not be motivated to train for a marathon because that's just way out of what I'm capable of for right now. So we know that people, and teenagers in particular, do tend to feel more motivated when they're interested and when they feel capable with something that has an appropriate level of challenge for them. I think this is an important point too, because teens also have a hyper awareness of how they're viewed by others. So the desire for them to feel capable and appear capable to others can make it really hard for them to be motivated in times of challenge. And that's, I think, what a lot of students are feeling right now with this switch to online learning. So I think that's one reason a lot of teens are struggling right now, if their work might be pretty difficult and if they no longer have the support of their peers and their teachers, and they want to appear capable, but they're struggling in that sense. So that may damage their motivation as well. Does that help, Amy?
Absolutely, thanks. And I want to echo a couple of those. I sort of want to amplify a couple of those points to parents and then add a little bit of a clinical perspective to this question of why motivation might be lower than even normal right now. Within all the context of motivation is going to ebb and flow and vary within person. But I want to amplify what you said about this idea of confidence about success, because I think a couple things have happened in the transition to online learning that I'm not sure that we as parents always completely understand from the student perspective. So one is, this is a pretty unfamiliar learning environment for a lot of kids, in which what the parameters for success are can be unknown or can be hard to attain because it's happening very remotely and without a lot of contact with people. What happens when I turn in that assignment? Are things even being graded? There's a lot of uncertainty about that. And so that was one thing that really stood out to me, which is if you don't know, or you're not confident that you're going to be successful, it's going to be harder to be motivated. And so I think online learning might provide an environment in which the confidence interval around success is less clear. The other one, and you mentioned this briefly, and that I want to amplify, is I think one of the things that all of us parents right now are learning is how much work teachers do. And we forget, I mean, we think about our teenagers like, oh, our high schools just go to class and they manage everything and it's fine. And why am I having to do so much supervision? But they don't go into a bubble when they go to school. They have regular daily contact with teachers who are other adults and other humans who are giving them sort of gentle guidance and support and encouragement and nurturing. And that is part of what is keeping them motivated and on track and helping them understand what those parameters for success are. We've removed all of that. And these kids are just not getting those moment-to-moment interactions with teachers and peers that are a lot of other adults and support folks in their lives that they were used to. So those are two things you mentioned that I want to amplify. And then I want to talk a little bit just briefly about a clinical explanation also for why motivation might be low. And this is not necessarily true for every teenager, but for a portion of the teenagers out there, I think we need to consider the possibility that the problems with motivation might be representing other issues going on right now. So one of the things we talked about in our first webinar was kind of the high rates of depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and feelings of grief and loss among kids. All of those are sort of mental health clinical concerns for which motivation is a really common symptom. And so that isn't to say that every kid out there who's struggling with motivation, it really may be motivation. But I think it's something to keep in mind as educators, parents, and clinicians to just step back and wonder, is that low motivation actually a sort of a symptom or a sign of something else going on clinically? Because that would be really common. So the way that low motivation can show up for kids clinically can look like boredom, can look like I don't care, can look like difficulty concentrating, low energy. And those are all really common symptoms of depression, grief, and loss, which I think a lot of our kids are actually struggling with right now. So I think that's one thing to just keep in mind. And during the Q&A, if parents have questions about, well, how could I tell the difference between when this is sort of motivation really about school that I can help my kid work on, or when is this something of a more clinical concern, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. So thank you, Monica, for that great introduction to what motivation is and the difference between sort of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. What I'd like to talk about now, sort of what is normal for a teenager and how teenagers might look different in their motivation than kids or adults. Adolescence is sort of by definition a developmental transition period when kids are no longer kids, but not yet quite with the fully functioning brains of adults. And there's a lot happening in the brain. during this time period that might be affecting motivation that would just be important, I think, for all of us to keep in mind. And I've asked Michelle to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, adolescence is definitely a developmental period for the brain and looks very different than childhood or adulthood. And adolescence was really called out in the relatively recent past as this distinct period that's totally different than being a child and totally different than being an adult. And it's a relatively long period of time. If we think about the beginnings around age 11, Monica, with your child, is sometimes even a little bit younger than that. If we think about the start of puberty, all the way up, honestly, into early 20s. So it's an incredibly long and dynamic period of brain development with a lot of implications. So that brain development is really at least part of the reason why motivation looks so different for adolescents than it does for children or fully fledged adults. Specifically, brain-based changes happening in adolescence lead to problems controlling emotions, doing risky behaviors, and having low motivation to do unpleasant tasks that serve long-term goals, but not anything really immediately. And so a lot of the research that looks at motivation in adolescence focuses on those things: big emotions, drive to do things that we as adults would say are pretty risky, and then low motivation for things that don't serve me right now. So if you're a parent of a teen, or if you're a teen yourself, you're probably familiar with the idea that emotions, both positive and negative, are pretty supercharged in adolescence. That means that unpleasant activities like really difficult homework or a chore you don't like are even more unappealing and unmotivating because they're associated with negative emotions that get even bigger for adolescents. So little frustration is now big deal frustration. On the flip side, exciting activities and even some of those risky behaviors that we as adults find it hard to understand why they seem fun and not terrifying, are pretty hard to resist for a teenager. And just a little bit of a side note here is I would say that one of those really exciting activities is screens. So screens are designed for the teenage brain, basically, to just give lots and lots of doses really rapidly of excitement, which leads to just incredible dopamine releases in the brain and a very happy brain in that moment, but maybe not motivated to do anything other than screens. So at the same time, the self-regulation center of our brain, you might also hear it called executive functions, is really slowly developing, and it won't be done developing until your 20s, actually. That means that doing things that take a lot of self-regulation, like stopping yourself from doing something that's really fun and pivoting to go do something that's really unpleasant, is so much harder for a teenager. Doesn't mean that it's impossible. As Monica was saying, there's things that we can do to make that pivot easier. It just means that you're going to need that support to make it more likely to happen. So this combination of really big emotional reactions to both reward and unpleasant situations and reduced ability to really hold those future consequences and goals in mind in the moment lead to a teen's tendency to really do what feels good right now. And that combination, we actually sometimes refer to it as like a really supercharged race car with a driver that's just learning to drive. So it can go off in a direction really fast and really far and be kind of erratic. One final note I'll say on teenage brain development and motivation is that teen years are a really rough period for regulation of sleep and arousal. And that is really bad news for motivation because no one is motivated when you're sleep deprived except to go get more sleep. So a good sleep hygiene routine, including things like a regular bedtime, is even more important as a teenager, but probably harder to enforce for a teenager. So just ballpark, teens should be getting about 8 to 10 hours of sleep per night. 70% of teens don't get that. So I would just also kind of put a pin in sleep as something that can really underpin a lot of problems with motivation if it's not really there for your teen.
Okay, wow, super helpful. So I think I'm going to paraphrase a couple of things back, and you can nod or tell me if I'm saying what it is I think you wanted us all to hear. So I think part of what you're saying is sort of by definition, teenagers are not really wired to have the strongest motivation, because a lot of motivation, if you're not sort of going to get some immediate pleasure out of something, then what you're really holding on to, what's motivating you, is kind of a longer term goal. And that's a harder thing for a teenage brain to hold on to. And that makes a lot of sense to us. I think those of us who have kids who are like, you need to get good grades in high school so you can go to college, so you can get a good job. And the kids are like, yeah, the video game is right here, mom. And that trade-off is just very hard for them to know. To me, the thing that comes up is, well, that's not different. I mean, teens have been teens forever, right? So what's different now during COVID that would be amplifying these low motivations? And that's when I think we have to think about all the contextual supports that have changed for kids. So I come back to, kids were probably getting a lot more support and motivation at school from their peers and their teachers than we probably appreciated, in terms of helping them keep an eye on what short-term goals are and how those are connected to other goals. And I think that sort of ratio between things that are rewarding to things that are, you just have to work towards because they're important to work towards. A lot of that for kids is around their peers and interaction with their peers and social interactions. That was part of what was rewarding about being at school and doing their work, was it being in a social environment. And we've removed all of that from kids, and we're asking them to do the very hard stuff without any of the sort of rewarding aspects to it. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. I also want to highlight that social piece, because there's actually some good research showing how much more motivating social context is for teenagers than for children. So that we see that showing up in peer pressure in a negative way, but we also see that show up in the classroom as motivation to do well in front of your peers and gain social approval. And those external motivators, if we harness them in the right way, can actually be really helpful. And when all of that falls away, motivation is much lower if there isn't that support around you, but also the support pushing you forward to achieve those goals, for sure. I would also say that teen brains, as you were speaking to Amy earlier, have a harder time with cognitive challenges, especially. And so when you take away all of those supports and then introduce whole new concepts in academics or even in an activity that your child's really interested in, like playing an instrument, that becomes even harder. So we're taking away a lot of the support and challenging one of the hardest areas to harness motivation for kids and for teens, I'm sorry.
Okay, super helpful. And I know Monica is going to talk more in a minute about kind of the importance of fostering connection, social connection as a way to build motivation. But first, Anne, are we going to do our partway check-in?
Yes, thank you. All right, so we're about halfway through, and I want to encourage you all, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom. You can start submitting your questions for the team here. So we'll have plenty of time to answer them at the end, but thanks for filling out the poll. I think just a quick check, we have about 55% that is looking at you have concerns around this being a larger mental health concern, 45% struggling with not being on track for college or job plans, and about 30% getting behind in school. So I think we are really, we are all in this together, and definitely we'll be happy to answer your questions at the end to address any specific concerns we haven't.
Great, thanks. Okay, so the biggest question of the day, I think what everyone is most interested in is sort of practical hands-on tips. How can we leverage, as parents in particular, but also clinicians and educators, what we know about the teen brain, what we know about motivation, what we know about learning, to actually help improve motivation and help kids be more successful. And so Monica, I know this is right in your wheelhouse of your area of research. So if you have any practical advice for us, we would love to hear it.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, and hopefully I can build on some of what Michelle and you, Amy, were talking about before as well. It all kind of blends together. So yeah, I realize that this is the question on a lot of parents' minds right now. How do I motivate my teen? What can I do to make this better right now? And I know it's really frustrating when you know what your child should be doing and you see that they're not focusing on it, they're not doing it, and you don't know what to do to help them. So yeah, there is a lot that we know from motivation research that can help this conversation. So I'm happy to talk through some of the ideas that might be most helpful for parents right now. So when I was thinking about this, one way that we break down motivation research when talking to teachers a lot is to focus on the ABCs of motivation. And I think this can be a really helpful framework for parents as well. So the ABCs that I'm going to talk about come from a theory called self-determination theory, which is a really complex theory that has been researched for decades, but it focuses on the differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and on these three basic human needs that all of us have in order to feel motivated by something. And those needs are autonomy, belonging, and competence. So I'll talk through each of those. So the first one, probably the most important, especially for teens, is the need for autonomy. Autonomy means that the teens want to feel in control of their own lives. They want some independence and they want to have choices in what they do and how they do it. They want to direct their own lives, basically. So in order to help motivate your teen, I would say to try not to demand what they should do, especially with threats and consequences. But rather you want to try to help them make good decisions right now. So saying things like, look, I know you have a lot of work to get through. Would you rather wake up early, get it all done? Or would you rather, take your time and maybe start after lunch? So giving them those choices. Now, sometimes it's not practical to really give a choice about something, like they have to do their work no matter what. So in those cases, it can help people feel more autonomy actually when you empathize with their perspective. So empathy is really important here. Saying things to your kid like, look, I get that you really don't want to do this. And I understand I wouldn't want to do hours of schoolwork at home either. I know it's not as fun when you're not at school. So how can we make it easier to get through it? Maybe a schedule would help, and sort of problem solving with your child there. I think this empathy and this understanding just goes such a long way. So let them know that it's okay. As Michelle said, they have big emotions right now. Let them know that those emotions are normal and it's okay to feel that way, that nothing is really ideal right now for any of us. And we're all kind of going through this together, but that you understand where they're coming from. And that can help them feel like they have more of a choice because their perspective has been validated in that sense. So that's autonomy. Whenever possible, giving students choices, helping your child make these decisions on their own rather than putting it out for them is going to help them feel more capable, more in charge of doing it themselves. Now the B stands for belonging. It's kind of this sense of relatedness or a relationship. We all have a basic human biological need for close relationships. Now teens, as we talked about, are typically fulfilling this need with their social relationships with friendships. And I know this isolation right now is really tough on teens. So their desire to talk and text and FaceTime with their close friends is really understandable and normal. And if there's any way that their schoolwork can be collaborative with friends, that can help improve their motivation. But they can also fulfill this need for belonging through their relationships with you as their parents and with other family members. So again, empathy comes into play here. Validating their feelings and showing genuine interest in what they're thinking and how they're doing can help to strengthen your relationships right now, and that can be really helpful. Also taking breaks, making time for fun with them, letting them know that you love them and that you're proud of them when they're doing really hard things like this. You'll see that when they're in a good place in terms of feeling loved and feeling like they belong, they will be more inclined to be motivated to work. It's not perfect, but it does help. That sense of relationship and belonging does help. And then the third need is kind of something we talked about a little bit before. It's the C for competence. And so this is when I talked about how we feel more motivated when we're capable of accomplishing something. So if you suspect that your child might be lacking motivation because they just don't feel competent at something, like maybe they think something's too hard or they're complaining they don't know how to do something. As a parent, I think you can try to find ways to help them feel more capable. So For example, if a child is feeling overwhelmed just because there's so much work, you can help them by helping them learn how to make checklists or to-do lists to make their work feel more manageable. So take a big project and break it down into small chunks. What do you start with? What's the next step? And having them make these to-do lists can be a great way to make them feel more competent. And actually, it can be a great life skill for their entire lives. I still do this myself when I have a project to work on and I make my to-do list and I cross it off, and it feels so great when you accomplish one small thing and then you feel more motivated to do the next step. So helping them learn that skill can really be helpful. And each time they get to cross something off, you know, you can recognize their work and affirm them and tell them, you know, I knew you could do it, good job. So that kind of praise and recognition can help a lot in their motivation right now. So you want to encourage them, help them see when their hard work does pay off with success. Now, if they really do need more help or the assignment is really just too advanced for them, you can also help them learn how to advocate for themselves with their teachers, to ask for additional resources or ask for help on something. So you're helping them problem solve to try to be more capable as well. So that's kind of what we're looking for in terms of using these ABCs to drive motivation home. And again, I just highlight that need for empathy. It goes along with all these that really can help students and children to feel more capable and more motivated at this time.
Okay, so helpful. And I love, and this is probably an academics thing, but like, I love rubrics like that, things like the ABCs. It helps me hold in mind what it is that, the big sort of takeaways. So that was really helpful, and I appreciate that framework and that that sort of, you know, heuristic for keeping track of strategies. I want to amplify the middle one, the one on belonging, because I don't know, I imagine a lot of the parents out there, most of us are on social media and Facebook and things. There's been it's not a meme exactly, but there's been a thing going around that was sent by a teacher. It was basically like, dear parents, you know, in September, I can take care of catching your kid up on any of the academics that they've missed, right? Like I can reteach the math, I can reteach the grammar, I can get them back on track for their test taking skills. What I can't do is solve, you know, family disruption, trauma, social emotional challenges. The best thing I need from you parents is kind of just keep your kids whole and safe. And that's, I think, part of what I heard from you is one of the things, and I think this is really hard for us as parents, because especially when we get anxious, we often displace some of our anxiety onto our kids, and we feel like some of the things in our worlds are out of control. We can't control when our kid is taking their SAT test, and we can't control how the grading is going to go, and we can't control when they get back to school. And so we want to control what we can, which is, gosh darn it, you should get that biology assignment done. And that isn't necessarily what's on our kids' mind. That's really about us. But what we can do is keep those relationships solid between us and our kids. And that was really what I heard. What I heard was, gosh, rather than making sure my kid is like getting, you know, her schoolwork done, I want to make sure my kid is okay, and that my kid knows I'm here for her, and that my kid knows I'm willing to listen to her. And there's a hidden agenda there, I think I heard you say, which is that if I'm doing that, if I'm checking in and empathizing and being loving and caring, actually that might give my kid the stability then from which to hear me about some of those strategies that might work, but also to sort of cultivate some of that own motivation. I'm thinking a little bit about specific techniques that that have worked for people. So one of the ones that I encourage a lot of the families and teenagers that I work with on that issue of sort of checklist and goal setting, but in the context of belonging, is to have a family check-in time. For a lot of families, that's actually evening time rather than morning, because mornings can sometimes be a little crazy, and especially with teenagers, maybe they're getting up at different times. But it is something we do in our family, which is that after dinner, we do it on Sundays for the whole week, but then we do it after dinner, just looking at the next day, where we check in, how was your day? And set small goals for the next day. Here's what is on the agenda for tomorrow. Here's what I need to get done. But we do it collectively. It's not just me one-on-one with each kid, like what are your assignments and what do you need to do? But it's like all of us, and I'll say my work goals for the next day. And so we do it in the context of the family relationship, where it's sort of understood that we're all setting our goals for the next day. So I think that's part of what I hear you communicating.
Yeah, Amy, I love that. I think that's a great idea. And I would say along with that, I think it's great when families can focus on the positive things as well. We've talked a lot about reasons why students aren't motivated right now because of all the negative things that are happening right now. But I think it's good to recognize that there are some benefits to the terrible situation we're in right now, in that families are getting more together time, and there are opportunities to cultivate that gratitude and to recognize the positives there. And just to piggyback off of something Michelle brought up earlier about the importance of sleep for adolescents. If your child is able to sleep in a little bit now, let them sleep in a little bit. I know educational research for years has been saying that schools start too early and that kids need more time to sleep. This is a great opportunity for your adolescent to catch up on some sleep that they've been dearly missing for years. So I think it's okay to relax some expectations around what time you get up and how you start your day and how you function, with the trade-off that if you are sleeping in, when you do wake up, these are the things that need to happen. This is how we need to get our day going. This is how we have a productive and positive day, not just being, on screens all day or being tired all day, but, using that sleep to energize you for your day and having those healthy and productive, happy habits, I guess.
Awesome, thank you. So actually next on my agenda was to provide some resources for parents, some books and a podcast that I think are really helpful, but I think I might save that to the end because I'm seeing some questions pop up, and I think this would be a good time to address some of them. So I'm gonna read one out. I'm gonna offer a little bit of my thoughts on it and then turn it over to see if Monica or Michelle have anything to add. So this is a mom writing, I have a usually high functioning senior accepted into the college of his choice and right now is absolutely not motivated to do anything. He is on his screen all day. And his explanation is, hey, I've worked hard for years. I'm already in college, so I shouldn't have to do anything. Anything I can do about this? It's a great question. And I know, Monica, you have an immediate answer. You want to take that?
No, I think that's an awesome question. And I think there's a lot of kids who are in this boat right now where they're already accepted and they feel great. I just want to put in a word as a former admissions officer that we did in fact decline acceptance to students who slacked off their entire senior year, the second half of senior year. We did take those spots away from time to time when there were other students waiting for those spots who were still working really hard. So I just want to put that out as a warning that it does happen, but with the caveat of saying that I'm sure there's going to be a lot of grace this year because of the current times, that I do think there will be grace for situations like this. My big thing as a teacher, as a admissions officer, in all my hats, is communication. So if a student is really having trouble and not motivated to do any work, are they communicating with their teachers? Are they letting them know why they're not doing it or what they're doing? I think there's a professionalism there and a communication that's really important. I think it's okay for a person in this situation to say, I've worked really hard. I need a little bit of a break. I'm going to prioritize these few things that really need to happen. And I'm going to let some things go and not be too concerned if I don't have straight A's right now. I think that's kind of healthy and okay right now. But the prioritization is really important and the communication is really important, and just knowing that this could come back and bite you later on. So making sure that you're willing to take those risks for your own health and well-being, but to be able to manage that and just know what's at stake there. And again, I think in a lot of ways we're playing a long game here. It's not just about the immediate what's happening, and if in the long run it's really important to get some break time and downtime, I wouldn't push too hard there, but I would make sure that you're having those conversations and talking about long-term impacts of slacking off now.
Michelle?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. I know at least some of the schools here in the Seattle area are completely off right now, and school is really quite optional. So I'm wondering if something else on the table here might be that I really don't have to do anything. There really aren't many consequences if I don't do this optional work. And so that can make it even harder to motivate when there's none of that, catastrophic outcome that could happen. And I think back to Monica's great point about a relationship, that's when a conversation with your teen about, okay, we've got this opportunity and it looked like it was going to maybe be just a couple of weeks at home, like an extended spring break. It's not anymore. it's quite long and will continue to be quite long. So now we're forming some habits, and we have this opportunity of a lot of time on our hands. How can I help you kind of make the most of it? Is there anything that you would like to spend that time doing that's more of a hobby, not necessarily even school? How can we build on those things that your highly motivated child was passionate about before, and fill that time, if not with academics, because it sounds like they have worked really hard on something that still seems like a productive use of time to you and your child, and isn't just kind of a one-dimensional screen.
I agree wholeheartedly with what both of you said. I want to separate the question into two parts too. One is this question. I think one of the concerns on a lot of parents' minds when we see our kids not being motivated is we get anxious about that as a character trait. We get anxious about what is that going to mean for my child for his or her entire life? Are they going to be a lazy person unable to ever get through college, get a job? Are they going to be living in my basement 20 years from now? I think that reflects a lot of our own anxiety. And so one thing that stands out to me is the phrase, my high functioning senior who's already into the college of his choice. So that I think that's one of the things. I think it's hard for us as parents to step back and say, actually, my child has shown they are capable of motivation and they're capable of rallying their resources when they are motivated. And I can maybe let go of a little bit of that anxiety right now and trust that it'll come back the next time he needs it, which isn't right now because he's already into college. Schools are, especially in Washington State, it's essentially pass fail. So the idea that there's going to be a long-term implication in terms of college admission is quite low. But I also want to amplify the other piece of it, which is, okay, so fine, we're not going to worry that he's not motivated to do things because maybe that's okay. And he does deserve a break and he's shown he's capable of motivation. But screen time all day, I don't think any of us thinks that that's healthy. And so I want to reiterate what Michelle said about, can we build in other activities? That's a separate problem to solve, so to speak. And I do love, again, Monica's point about belonging and using the family relationships and family time. And that may be something that requires a little bit of parental investment. Let's go for a walk together. Let's do an activity. Let's cook dinner together. Let's do an activity together. You can choose what the activity is, but it needs to be something that isn't on your screen. So I think those are very valid suggestions and concerns. I see two questions here at the bottom. Oh, that's a great question. Do we have a PDF of the ABCs, autonomy, belonging, and competence? We will get something. I'm going to have a series of resources and we will put them up on the upliftnavigator.com website in the next 1 to 2 days. And I will work with Monica to make sure that we have some kind of accessible summary of self-determination theory and what those ABCs are that we can get up on the website. So I don't have it handy right this minute, but absolutely we will do that. So thanks for that question. Okay, the other question, what about a teen who is cheerful, engages with family, doing fine with online school, but not motivated to call or text friends for social interaction? That's a great question. Michelle or Monica, do either one of you want to take that?
Yeah, I think it harkens back a little bit to the last question that we were talking about, just motivation for things that used to be important and highly motivating to your child, and now aren't as much. And I think a lot of this we can, with some confidence, can attribute to the context. Zoom interactions are no longer as fun as they were those first couple of weeks. The fun backgrounds and stuff are no longer that novel and exciting. And so it makes a lot of sense that when we take away all of the exciting parts about being with your friend, doing things that are spontaneous and being able to have that back and forth interaction in person, it's not as motivating. And I think that from the thought process side of things, you might say, this is kind of a stopover time, this COVID time, and I'll pick back up with my friendships when all of this is over. And I think having a conversation with your teen, just exploring, like, gosh, it's hard to keep up with, like, I'm finding it hard to keep up with my friendships during COVID. What is it like for you? What do you think your friends might be feeling in this situation? Do you think they like the Zoom stuff, or are there other ways? So kind of exploring this totally new thing of trying to have a relationship over a screen, and coming up with some creative ways with your teen that they would be excited about spending time with their friends with all of these limitations. And I think that going back to kind of the brain science, thinking through all of those barriers and potential solutions is a huge executive function self-regulation task. So partnering with your teen to have that conversation and think about possible really creative solutions to bring those friendships back can be so helpful in helping it happen.
I would add another piece. I have a child like this who is super social in person and actually hates being online or interacting on the phone or anything with others because it just doesn't feel as genuine. And so one thing that we've been trying to do is, again, kind of cultivating empathy and telling him, like, don't you think your friends would like to hear from you? Like putting it more on a perspective taking and saying, like, it would be really nice to reach out to your friend to see how they're doing, and kind of making it not so much about just him talking and wanting to do it, but doing what you think is going to be best for other people. So kind of teaching that life skill too of reaching out and looking how other people are, and how friendship is a two-way street. And sometimes even if it's not your preferred way of communication, it's important to be there for other people. So that's one thing that we've been trying to do that may work for other people. Another thing is to have ideas of activities or things to do, to talk through. If there's an online game they can play together while they interact, even that type of interaction is better than nothing in ways.
Yeah, I want to, I was thinking, especially as Michelle was talking, Monica, I was thinking about the C in the ABCs about competence. And what a lot of, I wonder, one of my hypotheses would be to this parent is if the issue with motivation to reach out to peers isn't about I'm uninterested, but I'm not sure I know how to be successful having a peer interaction in this new world. I knew how to chat with someone next to me in my classroom. I knew the seat that I sat in at lunch, the table of kids. I don't know if it's okay to reach out to that particular friend through Snapchat or Instagram. We didn't have that relationship before. And when kids don't feel certain of the outcome, if it's going to be well received, then they're not likely to do it. So I think there's probably a lot more fear there than maybe we can appreciate from the outside. I know my 14-year-old has articulated this quite clearly. The difference, my 17-year-old, it's just much different the older you get, but the younger, those middle and younger teens, so many of their social interactions are happening naturalistically through interaction. They're not so used to, they don't have the skill set. And so when you don't have that skill set, it can be very difficult to reach out, even though we fit them and think, we know as a parent, you have good friends, you have good social skills. Why is this such a problem? I wonder if your kid doesn't actually believe they have good social skills or are likely to be successful. So I really like Monica's approach too of flipping the game a little bit and wondering, helping the kid keep the perspective on, gosh, how would it feel to you to get an unsolicited text or Snapchat or Instagram from someone that you go to school with? I wonder if it would feel that way to someone too. Someone has to take the first step. I want to address a little bit one of the questions that came up before this, which is that we had in questions that were submitted prior to the webinar, which is where is the border between, this is social distancing related, low motivation, this is a change in context, versus this is part of a bigger mental health concern and I should seek more care. And it's come up in two ways. I've heard the question from parents in two different ways. One is, when is low motivation a symptom of something like depression? And the other is, when is low motivation, not just low motivation, but maybe a package of something like ADHD? I'm going to ask Michelle to speak on the ADHD one, but I'm going to speak a little bit on the depression one. So one of the things I think any mental health professional would say is, we never look at one behavior or one symptom or one problem when we're considering whether a bigger issue like depression or ADHD is there. We look at a pattern of emotions and behaviors across lots of settings. So what I'd say is, if you're concerned that your child might not just be lacking motivation, but might be something more concerning like depressed, I would be looking for their behavior outside of just the school context. I would be looking for what their mood is like in interaction with you. Are they able to show some positive engagement and positive emotions, interactions with their siblings, with their parents, with their peers? That would be very reassuring to me that in some contexts they're feeling and functioning normally. I would look at other behaviors that can go along with depression, like oversleeping. So catching up on sleep is one thing. Teenagers need a good 9.5 hours of sleep, but 12 to 14 hours of sleep, for more than a day or two is oversleeping and would suggest kind of possibly low mood or low energy. Similarly, not being able to sleep can be an indicator of that. Appetite changes, and isolation or low behavior. So it's one thing to not have motivation in one domain like school, but to not be motivated to really do anything, exercise, social interactions, play games, that might suggest a bigger concern. So that's what I would say is that if you're noticing that the low motivation is connected with other things that are concerning you, that's when you might reach out. And in the last minute, I'll give some resources about how you can do that. Michelle, do you want to say anything about sort of differentiating motivation and ADHD?
For sure. Similar to what Amy was saying, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means that usually there's glimmers of problems with attention, focus, motivation that are really long-standing and start early in childhood. So it'd be relatively rare to see these symptoms all together onset just during, the COVID crisis, and have that be something that we would consider ADHD. And it, as Amy was saying as well, there's a whole cluster of symptoms. So it wouldn't just be motivation, but it would be ease of distractibility, frequently getting off task, being very forgetful, and those behaviors happening for a long time. I will say that for some children with neurodevelopmental disorders, we do see the symptoms start to really manifest when some of the supports fall away. There's so much support for those executive function tasks in elementary school, right? Your teacher tells you, okay, now write it in your planner, or hands you the worksheet in the folder to bring home to your parent. When those things fall away in adolescence, we do sometimes see the symptoms for the first time because the child isn't getting all of those supports, and we just know we need to put them back in place. So if you've been seeing it for a long time, good idea, and it's very impairing, good idea to talk about it with your pediatrician.
Okay, we had another question come up, probably our last question, then we'll start wrapping up. Every family has a different way of managing social distancing right now. How do you deal with teenagers who are seeing other teens out in groups, but your family has been staying home and maintaining social distancing norms? It's very frustrating for the teen and causing family conflict. This is Monica's calling from the Midwest, but the rest of us are here in Washington State, where we went early on social distancing lockdown and we are persisting long. So this is an issue for many of our teens. And it's a challenging one. And so I would say the first thing to say is that this is not a new issue for families, right? Families for time eternal have had to deal with the issue of our family has different rules and expectations for our kids than other families might have. And so to some extent, this is a conversation that, however you might have managed conversations about, do you allow co-ed sleepovers? Do you allow your kid out? What's the curfew on Friday and Saturday night? That we've always had times when some families have different rules than other families. I think, and I'm a parent too, so I'm probably speaking about this as much of a parent as a clinician. It's important to have a sense of those family values and norms. It's going to be important to make sure that those values and norms are communicated clearly to the child. That does not mean that the child is going to agree with them, but that the rationale for the rule of, yes, I know your friends are going out and hanging out, and no, you're not allowed to, and here is why. Here's why we're making the decision that we're making. So I would say that's the first thing, is providing the rationale for the rule and not just enforcing the rule. That's huge for teenagers to feel like they are part of the process. That gives them, as Monica was saying, the autonomy to understand a little bit about what it is that's going on. The empathizing with understanding that this is frustrating, that they are seeing their peers able to do things that they're not able to do. And then the third would be to problem solve. Is there any other way to get the result that they want other than what it is that they're asking for. So the conversation can be around, can I go to the park today with my friends? To which your answer you've already said is no. Or the conversation can be around, I'm feeling left out. I'm worried I'm going to be left behind. I'm worried that I'm no longer part of these friendships. Okay, no, going to the park in person is an option. What are some ways in which I can help you achieve those interpersonal and friendship goals, which are very reasonable? So when we can move the conversation away from the rule around what you can and cannot do to how to get the very reasonable end met, I think that's when we can shift some of that conversation. So you have 1 or 2 minutes if Monica or Michelle wants to add anything to that one.
I can just add that, again, as we've been talking about adolescence, it's common for them to feel kind of invincible too, and to feel like unique, like I'm the only one who's being left out here. So helping to normalize that a little bit, like it's normal to feel that way. And like, I know you feel like it's not really a risk for you, or you feel like you're the only one left out, but I assure you you're not. And I assure you this is only temporary, even though we don't know when it's going to end, we know that it will. So things will be back to normal. You will be okay. Just reassuring that. But I think everything you said, Amy, is really great there.
So we're coming to the end. I wanted to share, so if you want to take parents and anyone in the audience, if you want to grab a piece of paper and a pen, I'm going to read off 2 book titles and 1 online video that are good resources. We will also get this up on the Uplift Navigator website in the next 1 to 2 days. But hopefully I gave you enough time to grab your pencil. So 2 books that I really recommend around helping kids be successful in identifying what their goals are and achieving those goals and being motivated to do so are The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens by Sean Covey. It's a great, there's one for parents too, many of you may know it, but the teen one is really helpful about helping kids identify what their own goals are, why those are their goals, and setting specific steps to achieve them. The other one is a book called Teens and Young Adults, Setting and Achieving Goals That Matter to Me. So again, I think you're seeing from both those titles a lot about sort of helping kids find their own intrinsic motivation for the things that matter to them. Then the video is one, it's a South by Southwest keynote speech by Jessica Leahy, and it's called Teaching the Gift of Failure. It's a great video on the importance of letting kids try some of these things on their own, and it being okay sometimes if they don't always achieve the goals that we may have for them, the importance of that. So those are 3 resources. In addition, if you are concerned about whether or not your child might need more support and it might be helpful to them to work with someone, at the upliftnavigator.com website, we do have clinicians who are available to work with kids around issues like motivation, self-esteem, depression, and anxiety, if those kinds of supports would be helpful as well. So I think that is all I have to say. I really want to thank Monica and Michelle for being here. I'm an adolescent researcher, but I would not say that motivation is my area of expertise. So it's been really helpful to me to benefit from both of your expertise in this area, and appreciate your giving your time to us this morning. Anne, do you want to sign us off?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for sharing, and we'll have a recording of this that will be played back that you can share with friends, and hang in there. We're getting through this one day at a time. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Monica and Michelle and Amy. Okay. Bye-bye.